David gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles turning white as the familiar, winding road stretched out before him. The small, weather-worn sign reading "Welcome to Millfield" stood crookedly on the side of the road, a reminder of the town's slow decay. Despite the years that had passed, everything seemed untouched, as if time itself had given up on this forgotten corner of the world. A distant memory flickered through his mind, the laughter of his younger self as he and Liam raced their bicycles down this very road, the thrill of youth making everything seem boundless. But the town he'd left behind in pursuit of a dream seemed smaller now, tinged with a sense of loss that he couldn't quite shake. As he drove through Millfield's main street, memories crept into his mind like ghosts, uninvited but persistent. The old diner still had the same chipped paint on its sign, and the hardware store where he'd worked his first summer job looked as tired as ever. The only new addition was a mural of faces, portraits of Millfield's late residents, painted on the brick wall of the local library. At the center was a face that stopped David cold. It was his mother, her gentle smile forever preserved in paint, her eyes seeming to follow him, silently reproaching him. The memory of that phone call resurfaced, the one he had missed because he was half a world away in Syria, chasing a story. He had ignored the missed calls from Liam, assuming his brother would understand. But when the news finally reached him, his world tilted, and every justification he had told himself for leaving crumbled. By then, it was too late. He was halfway around the world, and his mother was gone. He hadn't been there for her final moments, nor for Liam, who had been left to shoulder it all alone. Finally, he reached the small, whitewashed house he had once called home. It stood there, stoic yet neglected, as if the house itself was waiting for an explanation from him. The garden, which his mother had once tended to meticulously, was now overgrown with weeds and wildflowers, an unruly testament to time's passing. He parked the car, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. This was it, no more running. As he stepped out of the car, he spotted Liam on the porch. His younger brother's face was as familiar as it was foreign, etched with lines of responsibility and loss that David had never seen before. Liam's gaze was steely, his posture rigid, hands tucked into his pockets as if to keep himself from reaching out, or maybe to shield himself from the words he knew David might bring. "Hey, Liam," David managed, his voice rough from the weight of emotions he hadn't yet unpacked. Liam didn't respond immediately. He just stared, his eyes cold, praising. After a beat of silence that stretched uncomfortably, he muttered, "Didn't think you'd actually come." David swallowed, feeling the accusation lingering in the air between them. "I thought it was time," he said quietly, unsure if that was enough to explain everything he had left unsaid. "I know it's been a while." Liam's eyes flickered with a mixture of hurt and resentment. "A while? David, it's been years. You missed everything. You weren't here when Mom needed you, or when I needed you." His voice caught, a crack in his otherwise impenetrable wall, but he quickly recomposed himself, retreating behind a shield of bitterness. "I know," David replied, his voice soft, though he felt like shouting to shake his brother, to make him understand the complexities that he himself was still struggling to comprehend. "I know I let you down. I let Mom down." Liam's gaze sharpened, his expression a mix of anger and disappointment. "That's one way to put it." Silence settled over them, thick and suffocating. David glanced at the house, noticing the peeling paint, the broken window on the side that hadn't been repaired. These were small signs of neglect that spoke volumes. It was as if the house had borne the weight of his absence, growing weary under the strain. Liam followed his gaze. "Don't act so surprised," he muttered, the edge in his voice clear. "It's not like I had the time to take care of everything while you were off in your war zones, writing stories that were more important than your family." David winced, the accusation hitting its mark. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. What could he say? How could he justify years of missed birthdays, holidays, and now, his mother's final moments? His dreams, once so noble and ambitious, now felt hollow. I thought I was doing something that mattered," he finally whispered, more to himself than to Liam. "More than we mattered?" Liam shot back, his voice laced with hurt. "Because that's what it felt like, David. Every time you sent one of those letters, every time we got a postcard with some beautiful picture of a city none of us would ever see, it was just a reminder that you'd chosen them over us." David felt the sting of those words, and his vision blurred as tears welled up. This was the pain he had been running from all these years, the weight of his choices finally catching up with him. "I'm sorry, Liam," he said, his voice breaking. I thought I could make a difference. But I see now that I only left behind people who needed me more." Liam's expression softened, just a fraction. He looked away, his shoulders slumping. "Sorry doesn't bring her back, David. It doesn't erase the years you missed." David's heart ached with a familiar, consuming guilt. "I know, and I can't undo any of it. But I'm here now. I want to try and make things right, whatever that means." Liam sighed, the fight in him seeming to dissipate. "It's not that simple. You don't just get to show up and fix everything. Life moved on without you." David nodded, accepting the hard truth. He hadn't expected forgiveness. He only hoped for a chance to make amends. Liam turned, heading toward the door, pausing only to glance back. "You're welcome to stay, but don't think this changes anything overnight. There's a lot to face, and some of it, you can't just fix." With that, he disappeared inside, leaving David standing alone in the twilight, feeling the full weight of his choices bearing down on him. The next morning, David found himself awake early, lying in bed and staring at the ceiling. The house was eerily quiet, filled with an uneasy silence that pressed down on him. He couldn't shake the feeling of being a stranger in his own home, a place once filled with laughter and warmth, now cold and hollow. He sat up, running a hand through his hair, and forced himself out of bed. His feet carried him through the house almost by instinct. Each step seemed to unlock memories long buried, a faint smell of coffee that reminded him of his mother's morning rituals, the faded wallpaper in the hallway where he and Liam had once measured their heights with pencil marks. Everything seemed to belong to another lifetime. He made his way to the kitchen, where he found Liam already up, leaning against the counter with a mug of coffee in his hand. His brother looked up briefly before focusing his gaze on the window, staring out at the overgrown garden. "You're up early," David remarked, trying to sound casual, though he felt the awkwardness hanging between them. Liam didn't respond immediately, just sipped his coffee and nodded. "Always am," he replied flatly. "The habit comes with taking care of everything around here." David swallowed, feeling the subtle jab. He took a step closer, noting the dark circles under Liam's eyes, the weariness etched into his face. Life had clearly taken its toll on his brother, and David couldn't help but feel that he was part of the reason. "Liam," he began softly, struggling to find the right words. "I know I left a lot on you when I left. I can't change that. But I want to help now. Whatever needs fixing around here, I'm here to do it." Liam's gaze remained fixed on the garden. His lips tightened, a bitter smile playing at the corners. You think you can just come back and make it all better by picking up a hammer or pulling a few weeds? David took a deep breath, keeping his tone steady. I don't think I can fix everything. No, but I want to try. I owe it to you and to Mom. At the mention of their mother, Liam's face twisted with a flash of pain that he quickly masked. He set his mug down on the counter and turned to face David fully, his arms crossed. Mom spent years wondering where you were, David. Every letter you sent, every postcard, she'd hang it up like it was proof that you still cared. But she knew deep down that you were gone, and she just wouldn't admit it. The words hit David like a punch to the gut. His chest tightened, and he found himself struggling to breathe under the weight of his brother's accusations. She was proud of you, you know, Liam continued, his voice trembling. Even when you didn't call, even when you missed holidays and birthdays, she would always defend you. She'd say, David's out there making a difference. Liam, he's out there changing the world. And I had to listen to that. Every single time. David's hands clenched at his sides, guilt and regret welling up within him. I didn't know she felt that way, he whispered, feeling his voice break. Of course, you didn't, Liam snapped, his voice laced with anger. You were too busy running around, playing hero. You never saw how she'd sit by the phone, waiting for your call, hoping that you'd come back. And you never did. David felt his throat tighten as the memories resurfaced. Harsh and unforgiving. He remembered his mother's letters, each one filled with warmth and love, asking him to visit, to come home for a while, and each time, he had pushed the letters aside, telling himself there would be time to see her later, once he'd finished his work. Liam's voice softened, though it was still tinged with bitterness. By the end, David, she stopped waiting. She stopped asking for you. I think she realized that you'd moved on, that this place didn't matter to you anymore. David's eyes stung, his vision blurring as tears threatened to spill. He struggled to find his voice, the words heavy on his tongue. Liam, I didn't mean to hurt her. I didn't mean to hurt you. Liam's gaze bore into him, a mixture of anger and pain simmering in his eyes. Intentions don't erase the hurt, David. They don't change the fact that I had to be the one to sit with her when she was sick, that I had to watch her fade away while you were halfway around the world, living your dream. A heavy silence fell between them, filled with the weight of unspoken emotions. David felt the enormity of his mistakes pressing down on him, the years he had sacrificed in the pursuit of something that now felt empty. Is there anything I can do to make it right? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Liam looked at him for a long moment, his face softening just a bit, though the anger still lingered. You can't change the past, David, but maybe, just maybe, you can be here for the people who are still left. David nodded, understanding the unspoken message. His brother wasn't ready to forgive him, but he was offering a chance, however small, to make amends. It wasn't much, but it was more than David had expected. Just as he opened his mouth to respond, a soft knock on the door interrupted them. Both brothers turned to see an elderly woman standing outside, clutching a basket of flowers. David recognized her instantly, Mrs. Thompson, their neighbor who had once been like a second mother to him and Liam. Liam moved to open the door, his expression softening as he greeted her. Morning, Mrs. Thompson. What brings you by? She smiled warmly, though her eyes flicked briefly to David, surprise and recognition lighting her face. Oh, Liam, I just came to drop off some flowers for your garden. Thought it could use a bit of color. She handed him the basket, glancing at David with a small nod. David, it's been a long time. David managed a smile, though he felt the weight of her words. Yes, it has. It's good to see you, Mrs. Thompson. She gave him a gentle smile, her gaze filled with a mixture of warmth and sadness. Your mother would have been happy to know you're home, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. The words pierced through David, and he felt a lump form in his throat. He swallowed hard, trying to keep his composure. Thank you, he replied, his voice shaky. I'm here to make things right. Mrs. Thompson nodded approvingly, though her eyes held a hint of something more, perhaps doubt, or maybe hope. She turned to Liam, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. It's good that you two are together again. Family is all we have. In the end, Liam's face softened, and he gave her a small, grateful nod. Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. You've always been there for us. She patted his shoulder, her smile warm and reassuring. I'll leave you boys to catch up. Just remember, life's too short to hold on to anger. Your mother would want you both to find peace. With that, she gave them a final nod and turned to leave, her footsteps soft on the gravel path. David watched her go, feeling a deep sense of gratitude and sadness. Her words lingered, a gentle reminder of what he had lost and what he had yet to gain. As the door closed, David turned to Liam, who was still holding the basket of flowers, his expression unreadable. Maybe we can plant these together, David suggested hesitantly, hoping to bridge the gap between them. Liam glanced down at the flowers, his gaze softening as he seemed to consider the idea. After a moment, he nodded. All right, but don't think this fixes anything. There's still a lot we need to talk about. David nodded, understanding the weight of those words. I'm here for as long as it takes. Liam, I'm not going anywhere. Liam's gaze softened, and for the first time, David thought he saw a flicker of the bond they had once shared. It was fragile, tentative, but it was there, a small spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way back to each other. Together, they stepped outside, carrying the flowers into the garden. As they knelt in the soil, working side by side in silence, David felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. This was the beginning, a small but significant step toward healing the wounds he had left behind. And as they planted the flowers in the garden that had once been their mother's pride and joy, he silently promised her that he would do whatever it took to make things right. The sun rose higher, casting its warm light across the garden, illuminating the vibrant petals of the newly planted flowers. David and Liam worked quietly, their hands brushing soil over the roots as they settled each plant into the earth. The silence between them was thick, a careful truce held together by shared memories and an unspoken understanding that the road to forgiveness would be long and winding. After an hour of tending to the plants, Liam sat back on his heels, wiping the sweat from his forehead. He looked around at the patches of fresh blooms, their delicate colors bright against the otherwise neglected garden. Mom would have liked this, he murmured, almost to himself. David looked over at his brother, sensing the pain hidden beneath those words. He wanted to say something comforting, something that would convey the depth of his remorse. But words felt hollow. He had spent too many years speaking from afar, making empty promises he never fulfilled. She would, he finally said, his voice soft. She loved this garden. I remember how she'd spend hours out here, even after a long day at work. Liam nodded, his eyes distant. Yeah. She said that flowers reminded her that there's beauty in everything, even when life gets hard. A bittersweet smile crossed David's face. She always had a way of finding the silver lining. Liam's gaze flicked toward him, something unreadable in his expression. She was more patient than either of us. David chuckled softly, acknowledging the truth in that statement. Their mother had been the backbone of the family, holding everything together through sheer force of will. It was that same resilience that David had admired. Yet it was also what he had run from, afraid of the responsibilities that would tie him down. But now, looking at Liam, he could see the toll it had taken on his brother, who had been left to bear the weight alone. As they continued their work, Liam's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen and sighed, the faintest hint of frustration flickering across his face. David noticed but said nothing, watching as Liam stood and dusted off his hands. "I need to go handle something," Liam said, slipping his phone back into his pocket. "One of the guys at the garage messed up an order, and I have to sort it out." David nodded, masking the pang of disappointment that rose within him. He wanted more time with Liam, to rebuild the bridge he had so carelessly burned. But he understood that trust wouldn't be restored overnight. "All right, I'll keep working here," he offered, hoping it would show his commitment to staying and helping. Liam hesitated, as if he wanted to say something but thought better of it. Instead, he gave a short nod. "Sure, I'll be back later." With that, he turned and walked toward his truck, leaving David alone in the garden. The silence settled around him like a heavy blanket, and he felt the weight of years of absence pressing down on him. He glanced around, taking in the old wooden fence, the faded lawn chairs, and the empty birdbath that had once been filled every morning. David's chest tightened as memories flooded back, each one sharper than the last. He could almost see his mother here, her hands dirted from the soil, her smile bright as she encouraged him and Liam to help her plant the seeds that would one day become their garden. She had taught them to care for each plant, to nurture it and watch it grow, a lesson that he had disregarded in his rush to escape, to find a different life away from home. Feeling a sudden need to reconnect with her memory, David rose and walked back inside. Heading to the old family room, dust clung to the bookshelves, and the scent of aged wood filled the air. He scanned the room, his eyes falling on a small wooden box nestled between photo albums. He recognized it immediately. It was his mother's memory box, a treasure chest of keepsakes that she had guarded closely. With a hesitant hand, he lifted the lid, revealing an assortment of photographs, letters, and trinkets. The first photo he pulled out was one of the three of them, his mother, himself, and Liam, taken on a warm summer day when they had gone to the lake. He remembered that day, remembered the carefree laughter and the sense of belonging that had filled his heart. He couldn't recall the last time he'd felt that way. Underneath the photo lay a stack of letters, each one addressed in his mother's familiar handwriting. He picked one up, his heart pounding as he unfolded the fragile paper. The date at the top caught his eye. It was from a year after he had left, during one of the times he had stopped writing. "Dear David, I hope this letter finds you well. It's been a while since we last heard from you, and I wanted to make sure you knew that we're all right here, though we miss you terribly. Liam has been working hard to keep things running smoothly, but he misses you more than he lets on. You were always his hero, you know. He looked up to you like no one else. I understand that you have dreams and ambitions, and I'm proud of you for pursuing them. But I hope you'll find it in your heart to come back someday, if only for a little while. Life is too short, my son. I don't want you to look back and regret the moments you missed with your family. With all my love, Mom." David's hands shook as he read the words, his mother's gentle love reaching out to him from beyond the grave. Tears blurred his vision, and he struggled to keep himself composed. He had been so caught up in his own life, so focused on his dreams, that he had overlooked the people who had loved him unconditionally. Setting the letter aside, he sifted through the rest of the box, each item a painful reminder of the life he had left behind. There were school certificates, old birthday cards, even a few childish drawings he had made that his mother had saved. Each piece told a story, one of love, sacrifice, and resilience. Finally, he closed the box, his heart heavy with remorse. He had come back to make things right, but he realized now that it would take more than a few words or gestures. He would have to show Liam, and himself, that he had changed, that he was no longer the man who ran away at the first sign of responsibility. Hours passed, and the quiet weight of reflection settled deeply into David's soul. He spent the rest of the afternoon mending the fence, fixing the garden chairs, and tidying the yard. By the time Liam returned, the garden was transformed, its beauty partially restored. Though much work remained, Liam stepped out of his truck, eyeing the changes with a guarded expression. He walked over, glancing at David's handiwork before nodding slightly. "Looks better," he admitted, though his tone was still reserved. David wiped the sweat from his brow and straightened up. "I thought Mom would appreciate it." Wherever she is. A silence fell between them, both men lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Liam broke the quiet, his voice softer than before. "I found something at the garage today that I thought you might want." David turned to him, curious. Liam reached into his truck and pulled out an old baseball glove, worn and cracked with age. He held it out, his eyes fixed on it rather than David. "You left this in the attic. Mom found it a few years ago and kept it in her room. She said it reminded her of you." David's throat tightened as he took the glove, memories rushing back of countless afternoons spent playing catch in the backyard with Liam. Back then, their world had been so simple, so full of possibility. "I didn't realize she kept this," David said, his voice thick with emotion. Liam shrugged, though there was a softness in his gaze. "She kept everything that mattered." David looked down at the glove, the weight of it heavier than he remembered. "Thanks, Liam." For the first time, Liam's gaze softened into something resembling forgiveness, though it was laced with the caution of someone who had been hurt too many times. "Don't thank me yet. You've still got a lot to prove." David nodded, accepting the challenge. "I know. I'll keep trying. As long as it takes." Liam studied him for a long moment before nodding, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Good. Then let's get started on fixing this place up. I think it's time we made it feel like home again." The two brothers worked side by side as the sun began to set, their movements synchronizing in a quiet rhythm that spoke of shared history and unspoken promises. There were no grand gestures or proclamations, just the steady, silent work of rebuilding something that had been lost. And as they stood together in the fading light, David felt the smallest spark of hope, a fragile glimmer of what could one day become forgiveness. In the days that followed, the brothers fell into a tentative routine. Every morning, David would rise early and spend time working on the garden, restoring it to its former glory one flower bed at a time. Liam would join him when his work schedule allowed, fixing the fence, repairing the creaky deck, and mending various parts of the house that had long been neglected. Their conversations were still sparse, guarded with years of resentment and regret. But slowly, words started to fill the silences. As they worked together, little by little, they began to share fragments of their lives, speaking about the people they'd become, the burdens they carried, and the things they'd left unsaid. One humid afternoon, as they repaired a broken wooden bench in the backyard, Liam finally broached a topic he had been holding back. "You ever think about why you left?" he asked, his tone light, though his gaze was sharp. David paused, looking down at the rough wood under his hands. He knew this question was coming. It had lingered between them, unspoken, since the moment he had returned. But now, faced with it, he struggled to find the words. "Yeah," he replied after a long moment. "I think about it every day." Liam's jaw tightened, and David took a deep breath, his mind racing back to the years he had spent wandering from one city to another, chasing dreams that felt hollow in hindsight. "I think I was scared, Liam, scared of getting stuck here, of living a life I thought would hold me back. I thought I needed to escape to find something better, something that would make me feel alive." Liam nodded, his gaze distant. "And did you?" David's shoulders slumped as he shook his head. "No, I didn't find." Liam continued. "Do you remember when Mom got sick?" Liam asked, his voice almost a WH. David felt a pang of shame, the guilt hitting him like a punch to the gut. He had known about her illness, of course, but he hadn't been there to witness her struggle firsthand. By the time he had returned, she was gone, leaving him with nothing but regret. "I remember," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I should have been here. I know that now." Liam looked at him, a mixture of anger and sorrow in his eyes. "Yeah, you should have. But you weren't. I was here, David. I watched her fight every day, taking her to appointments, staying up with her at night when the pain was too much. She never stopped asking about you, never stopped hoping you'd come back." David's chest tightened, his hands clenching into fists as he struggled to hold back tears. "I was selfish. I thought I had all the time in the world. I didn't understand how much it would hurt to lose her. And I didn't realize what I was losing with you." The words hung heavy in the air, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. David wanted to reach out, to tell Liam how much he regretted every lost moment, every choice that had pulled him further from his family. But he knew that no words could erase the pain he had caused. After a long silence, Liam took a deep breath, his expression softening just a fraction. "Maybe you're here now because you finally understand. And maybe that's a start." They returned to their work, the quiet between them shifting from tense to contemplative. David felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that perhaps there was a chance to heal the wounds he had inflicted. But he also knew it would be a long road, one that required patience and unwavering commitment. As the days turned into weeks, David threw himself into the task of repairing the house, working tirelessly to restore the place his mother had once cherished. He cleaned out the attic, sorted through years of forgotten belongings, and even repainted the walls, covering the faded patches with fresh colors that brought new life to each room. One evening, after a long day of work, David sat on the front porch, watching the stars as they flickered to life in the darkening sky. His mind wandered back to his childhood, to the nights he and Liam had spent sitting here with their mother, listening to her stories and dreaming about the future. The creak of the porch steps pulled him from his thoughts, and he looked up to see Liam joining him, a beer in hand. He offered one to David, who accepted it with a nod of gratitude. They sat in silence for a while, sipping their beers and watching the stars, each man lost in his own memories. Finally, Liam spoke, his voice quiet but steady. "I hated you for a long time, you know," he admitted, his gaze fixed on the horizon. David swallowed, the weight of his brother's words pressing down on him. "I know," Liam sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't understand why you left. Felt like like you didn't care about us, about Mom, about anything we'd built here. David felt a pang of guilt, but he forced himself to listen, to let Liam voice the pain he had held inside for so long. I didn't know how to stay, he said softly. I thought leaving was the only way to figure out who I was, to find something more. Liam shook his head, a faint, bitter smile tugging at his lips. You thought you'd find more out there, but you left everything that mattered behind. David nodded, accepting the truth of those words. I see that now, and I know I can't change the past, but I want to try and make things right, if you'll let me. Liam was quiet for a long time, his gaze distant. Finally, he looked at David, his expression guarded but open. You're here now, trying to fix what you broke. That's a start. David felt a glimmer of hope, a small crack in the wall that had separated them for so long. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a chance, and he was willing to take it. Thanks, Liam, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Liam nodded, taking another sip of his beer. Just don't screw it up this time. They sat together in silence, two brothers who had been strangers for too long, each one holding onto the fragile hope that they could find their way back to each other. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with unresolved pain and unspoken words. But for the first time, David felt that he had a place here, a chance to rebuild what he had lost. And as the stars shone brightly overhead, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could earn his brother's forgiveness.